If you want to understand the woke ideas or the ideas of critical theory, if you read Mounk's book, you get a good grasp on this. And what Mounk is telling us is, I'm against this thing, but he shows himself as buying into this egalitarianism, as you called it, and collectivism and egalitarianism.
Rufo has this moral tone, which I think is probably more appropriate. The main problem with Rufo is that he only has it for the other side.
He explicitly says that what we need to fight the counter-revolution, one of the things he lists is myth. He explicitly says to reignite the public sentiment, right? Because he doesn't think ideas will work.
This is a symptom of his tribalism. This is why he is really no different in his operating principles than the people that he opposes.
One of the most important cultural trends of the last decade has been the rise of a new left-wing ideology and the ensuing political controversies over the kind of issues of race, gender, sexual orientation that it has brought to the fore. This ideology is referred to by a number of different names. Sometimes it's called woke ideology. We'll talk more about different terminology for it, I think. But it's recognizable, I think, to anyone who's been following American politics and culture as an ideology that emphasizes people's membership in identity groups like race, gender, and that frames the world in terms of oppressor and oppressed group dynamics that are deeply rooted and maybe inescapable. And it's an ideology that calls for radical social and political change, sometimes talking about things like the dismantling of the existing Western society. This ideology started in universities. It made its way from the campus to the boardroom and even to the streets of American cities, as we saw in 2020. And the conservative movement, now, of course, in power with the second Trump administration, has increasingly focused on opposing this left-wing ideology and defined itself as trying to fight back against it. And although the conservatives are now in power, this ideology and the kind of issues that it raises continue to define political debates today. And of course, it's still very prominent on the political left and in the universities. So I think it's important when trying to understand American politics and culture, where did this new left-wing ideology come from? How did it rise to prominence? And what is the right way to oppose it, to challenge it? And what should we think of the way that conservatives are opposing it? Are they doing so in the right way, or are they doing something that is similarly destructive? So given these issues, in this episode of ARI Bookshelf, we want to talk about two books, both came out a couple of years ago, that are seeking to explain where this ideology came from and how to oppose it. The two books are The Identity Trap by Yascha Mounk and America's Cultural Revolution by Christopher Rufo. So our panel today, I'm Sam Weaver, Associate Fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute, and joining me for this discussion are Ben Baer, Fellow and Director of Content, Nikos Sotirakopoulos, Visiting Fellow, and Ibis Slade, Honors Intern. All right, just to begin, I want to say a little bit about each book, what they're saying, and then we can get into what we think of them. So these two books, I think what they have in common is that they're both trying to look at this modern ideology by looking at the history of the ideas involved in it. They both go back to around the 1960s to try to identify some of the theoretical origins and then trace the progression of ideas and of cultural trends over the course of that period of decades. And it's worth looking at how they do this and what's illuminating, what's wrong, and also at the kind of different perspectives that these authors bring to it. Because part of the value, I think, of looking at these two authors is that one is more a liberal who is critical of people on his own political side, people on the left, and the other is a conservative who conceives of himself as fighting the left and is part of an opposing political faction. Rufo, of course, is the conservative. He's an influential activist. He's written on these issues and spoken on them, and he's been influential on the Trump administration, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, other conservatives. He's has this more activist bent, but he's coming into this book to try to give more of a history and an intellectual investigation. although he's still writing for an audience of conservatives, trying to advocate and encourage them to take certain steps. He's calling for a counter-revolution against what he's calling a cultural revolution. A thing to note about Rufo, I think, is if people are familiar with him as an activist, you're probably familiar with his bomb-throwing kind of mentality. And I think in his activism, he has a tendency to sensationalize, to frame things in a way that has political impact and sometimes is not entirely accurate. He's not really doing that in this book, but it's part of the context of his whole approach and his whole mindset. Mounk, on the other hand, is a liberal, and he's much more of an intellectual, a scholar, an intellectual historian, not really an activist. And he's writing this more for an audience of liberals and progressives, even people who are tempted by this ideology. He's also a type of person he's written books critical of the right, particularly the rise of the authoritarian right, and now he's also criticizing the authoritarian left, and he sees those as kind of related projects. He is also less focused on framing the ideology we're talking about as a type of Marxism. In fact, he thinks it's not Marxist, but more as a synthesis, a product of a lot of different strands of intellectual influence all coming together. And where Rufo is advocating a kind of activist counter-revolution, Mounk is trying to make the case for restoring a focus on liberal democracy and universalism. So let's start by getting into some of our thoughts about the ideology that they're talking about here, particularly their framing of the intellectual origins, where this ideology comes from. And in particular, I think we get two different accounts of the origins that may not be incompatible, but there's different focus. There's Rufo's focus on a kind of Marxist intellectual heritage, particularly on the intellectual Herbert Marcuse, and Mounk has an emphasis on a different set of thinkers, a postmodern set of thinkers, particularly Michel Foucault. I want to open it up here to see, what did you all think of these two different accounts of the intellectual origins of this ideology?
Well, I think it's important to get clear first on what the ideology even is that we're talking about before we try to figure out what its origins are. And Sam, you had in some notes we have here written down some of the key provisions of it, and it's worth just sharing those. So you had said they're summarized by 3 points. I can't remember, and this is Mounk's way of summarizing. The key to understanding the world is, one, the key to understanding the world is to examine it through the prism of group identities like race, gender, and sexual orientation. 2, supposedly universal values and neutral rules merely serve to obscure the ways in which privileged groups dominate those that are marginalized. And 3, to build a just world, we must adopt norms and laws that explicitly make the way the state explicitly make the way the state treats each citizen and how citizens treat each other depend on the identity group to which they belong. And I think that's a fair summary of some of the major elements of what the so-called woke ideology is. But I think it's worth saying right at the beginning that the fact that this has come to be known as woke, and I always put that in scare quotes when I use it, for several reasons that point to what we should really call it. Of course, that name starts out as a name used by its advocates, and which quickly then turns into a pejorative used by its critics, to the point where now the advocates no longer like to call it that because it's so associated with the criticism of the view. And we could talk more about why it's even called that in the first place. The idea basically is that if you realize these 3 points, you are awoken to the injustice of the oppressive system around you, and it's similar to what the conservatives call taking the red pill. But I don't like the terminology at all. A, because it's purely metaphorical, doesn't really illuminate much about the content of it. B, because using this merely metaphorical name obscures the fact that we have a real name for it that names the actual ideology, and it's a kind of egalitarian collectivism, and that's to put it in kind of technical philosophic terms. Collectivism, insofar as it sees the world as made up of these competing tribal identities, and you're defined by your membership in one of these tribes. That's why it's sometimes called identity politics, though even that is not very descriptive, because, I mean, there's a lot of things about one's identity that have nothing to do with membership in a tribe. So it's important first to get clear, it's a kind of collectivism, it's a kind of tribalism, whether it's your race or your sex or your gender or some, intersection of all of those. That's the tribe you are defined, your identity is defined in terms of. So it's tribalist collectivism. And the other thing about it is that it's egalitarian. And here, egalitarian doesn't just mean concern, very importantly, does not just mean concern for equal rights in the kind of classical liberal sense. It means concern for metaphysical equality, for equality of outcomes, for it's concerned whenever there is inequality of abilities, of achievement, and typically the egalitarian prescription is the way that you eliminate these inequalities is by knocking down the people who have abilities and achievement. And of course, they package that together with the kinds of inequality that are actually illegitimate, the kinds of inequality that stem from injustice, the kind of inequality that stem from racism, the kind of inequality that stems from oppression or coercion. But they treat all those the same, as though somebody who's achieved some kind of alleged benefits through injustice is in the same position as someone who's achieved a benefit because of actual ability and achievement. And it's super important that those are not the same. Egalitarianism runs it all together, and that's the problem with it. And so we need to be clear. That's what we're talking about here. It's wokeism is a kind of euphemism on both sides, I think. And we need to be clear about what the ideology is.
And here's one introductory comment from me, Sam. No matter how you view woke, one thing is certain, that this new left has fought the battle of ideas very successfully. They did not succeed because of some secret conspiracy. I wish it was so simple. They've succeeded because they have captured the minds, and they have installed, let's say, their software in the way many people view the world. Now, this means two things. The first is that the way to fight it is only by countering these ideas. So we have to fight them in the field of the battle of ideas, as opposed that there is a simple solution, for example, through politics. Now, indeed, there are many things that you could do through politics in terms of severing the relationship between the state, for example, and education. But at the end of the day, this is a battle that is going to be decided by, do you have better ideas to suggest? So that's the one thing. The second thing is, Ben did a great job in identifying what the two ideas behind quote woke is: egalitarianism, collectivism. This means the only way to fight it is if we counter these ideas. So someone who claims I am against woke but is a collectivist does not fight woke. Or if they fight woke, we're going to end up in something similar at the end of the day. Or someone who says, I want to fight, let's say, critical race theory, by bringing in a different type of identitarianism, a different type of collectivism. Again, all it will manage to do is that all together we go down to the abyss actually faster. So let's keep these two things. How do we fight them? By fighting the battle of ideas, and by bringing forward different ideas. This means, how do we evaluate these two books? Number one, do they understand what are the ideas at play? And number two, do they offer a solution that is focused on attacking these ideas? Collectivism and egalitarianism.
Yeah. And just to quickly add on to both points you guys raised, especially if we're identifying that this term woke or identity synthesis, which may be a better term, but seems to miss kind of what Ben's pointing out here, is this understanding of collectivism and egalitarianism hasn't been identified in Mounk and Rufo. And I think it's important that where they start their narrative is either in somewhat in, well, Young tends to deal more with American history and brings it up until the 1960s and deals with some of these, I guess, starting from international and making their way to America, whether physically or with their ideas. They get into the institutions and these ideas spread. And so does, and Rufo also begins his major story in the 50s and the 60s. But important to seeking out the origins and the actual meaning of this concept, and as Nikos is pointing out, to effectively fight it, I think we should understand, which is that these ideas, when framed as collectivism, egalitarianism, absolutely have roots in America, and absolutely have it in both sides of the spectrum, or both sides of these battle of ideas. And I think both of these two kind of books and people give great distillations of those perspectives, and we can see how do they really grapple with their own sides, collectivism or egalitarianism, or do they focus in on the ways in which the conservatives played a role in this supposedly only left-wing synthesis. We should understand how conservative ideas were integrated into this synthesis, and maybe how some conservative tendencies within American culture that we can track historically and that are significant during the 50s and 60s can also give us an even better picture of how this movement spread and was so successful. Because one thing a problem I have with their framing, and maybe we'll get into this a little later, is we're talking about ideas spreading, but their kind of view of how ideas spread is it's like dominoes falling, and it's kind of passive and inert. And I think there's a little something more, I guess, active happening in the culture. And it's definitely with something such a significant change as this, it's not just indoctrination. I call it the indoctrination theory of history. It's not just people being tricked or convinced of, like, they're convinced for a reason, and we should figure out why those reasons they were given were convincing. So
I like that point, Ibis, that they think of them as dominoes, and I agree they're not really like dominoes. They have a lot to do with, if we think these ideas are irrational ideas, if we think they're wrong, then people don't accept them because they are logically convinced, because they're not logical. But they do accept them because they serve some need in their thinking, in their psychology. And that's definitely something I want to come back to. But another reason that it's not like dominoes is, you think about it like dominoes, you think of it, oh, there's a clear and obvious tipping point where someone pushes over the first domino. And that's actually the way Rufo thinks of it. He's on page 3 or page 2 of the book, right at the beginning, he says, the story of America's Cultural Revolution begins in 1968. And then from there, it's Herbert Marcuse is the one to push over the first domino, and all the rest follows. And that's just laughable intellectual history. Like, I think there's a lot of interesting history in this book where he does detail the kind of the chain of influence that Marcuse has on subsequent thinkers and activists, from Angela Davis to Derek Bell on down. But to think of it, it all starts in 1968, as though Marcuse wasn't influenced by a lot of other intellectuals, and as though he's really just trying to blame it all on the hippies, which is kind of the reactionary conservative style of thinking. It's really laughable. I mean, there's even plenty of evidence in his own book about the fact that there's a longer history here. And like when he talks about Angela Davis, he frequently wants to say, despite her appeals to Kant and Hegel, suggesting that it's not really Kant and Hegel who's influencing Angela Davis, that she's just using that as cover, as though Kant and Hegel are that respectable, respectable Western Enlightenment philosophers who we need to say, respect for, and just think of Angela Davis as hijacking them, when that's very far from the case. He illustrates later in the book how Angela Davis uses Hegel's master-slave dialectic to understand oppression, and in a plausible way. So one of the things I think that makes Mounk's story somewhat more respectable is he sees at least some more of that intellectual influence. And you mentioned, Sam, earlier that he starts not with Marcuse, but with Foucault and with the post-structuralists and postmodernists. And I don't think he pretends that it starts with them, it's just that he starts his story with them. And it's important that he does, because if anything, the postmodernist rejection of grand narratives that he talks about is much more of what accounts for the important nihilistic aspect of the egalitarian movement that he himself is criticizing. And to not bring that in is to really miss something.
I think a feature of Rufo's account is that it really focuses in on Marcuse and a kind of line of thinkers that he sees as following him. And he really sees this as a very intentional campaign where Marcuse and some of these other people kind of got together and decided to take over American institutions, and look, lo and behold, they did it. And I'm not saying there's no truth to something like that. I mean, some of these people did write it, that this was their intention and this was what they were going to try to do. But Rufo, I think, presents it as this is all kind of coming out of a plan by a few of these figures, whereas Mounk has, Ibis, you mentioned a few minutes ago that Mounk uses this term identity synthesis as a name for the ideology. And I think that name, it's better than woke in the sense that it's not just like this kind of complete metaphor, but it's also, I don't think it's that illuminating as in comparison with talking about the egalitarianism of the ideology that really captures what it actually holds. But I think part of Mounk using that term synthesis, what he's trying to capture is there's a lot of different intellectual threads that are coming together into the formation of this ideology. Foucault is an important one, but he doesn't deny that Marcuse plays some sort of role in this, or that there are other thinkers who come up with different ideas that kind of combine over the course of decades into this viewpoint that they're drawing on. Foucault had this insight, and I'm going about power and discourses, and I'm going to add that to this other insight that I have. That's more the picture of intellectual influence that Mounk depicts. And I think it as at least takes much more seriously the fact that people adopt different ideas because they're convinced of them, or because they find there's a value to coming to hold them, and that it's intellectual influence is not just kind of like a straight line often between somebody has a plan to insert this into people's minds, and then they do it, and then it happens in the kind of domino type way.
Yeah, one reason that people are convinced by these ideas relates to the point that Ibis made a few moments ago about how it's important to think about the ways in which conservative ideas interact with these nominally leftist ideas. And the major conservative idea I have in mind here is none other than Christianity. I mean, if you read Rufo's account of Pablo Freire, who's the Brazilian activist who has enormous influence on pedagogy in the United States. And Sam, you can tell us more about that, I'm sure. I mean, he has a famous book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And Rufo's own book talks about how Freire explicitly cites his Christianity as influencing his pedagogy of the oppressed. I mean, Christ is usually someone who's associated with, caring about the meek and the humble of the earth. In other words, the oppressed. So is it that shocking that a major religion has a influence on all of Western culture, saying, "Blessed art thou who, kneel down to the meek and the humble," and then these ideas that explicitly focus on liberating the oppressed from the left will have an effect on them because of this religious influence. And then it should also come as no surprise that the so-called woke egalitarian collectivists who take over our cultural institutions are frequently criticized by even the conservatives for adopting a kind of religious mentality. And I mean, Rufo himself cites these characteristics of them without perhaps realizing where they might be coming from. Like he talks about how the quote-unquote neo-Marxists want us to confess to various forms of original sin. If you're white, you're inherently sinful, you're inherently racist. They try to make you feel guilty. They want you to purify yourself through renunciation of your privilege. They have faith in an orthodoxy. Those are all his ways of characterizing what he calls neo-Marxism. Well, where do you think they come from? Why do you think they have an appeal? Because of religious ideas that treat these ideas as sacred, and the left, simply takes these ideas, puts a certain kind of secular spin on them. That's part of why they spread and why they're appealing. It's not. They're not dominoes. These ideas serve certain kinds of, I think, neurotic psychological needs that people have, and gives them a sense of pseudo self-esteem. They feel like they are being good people by following them because they've been taught by their ministers and preachers for decades that that's what it is to be good.
Let's take it a step further, Ben. You said that these ideas are very influential. They're so influential that they've even captured, in a way, the new right itself, the political movement in which Rufo is fellow traveler, however you want to call it. Let me give you an example. What is one of the central tenets, the central messages of, quote, neo-Marxism or the Frankfurt School? That capitalism, through materialism, which means caring about stuff, through abundance, has alienated us, which means we found meaning not in our true essence, but we find meaning in consumption. And through consumption, we've lost who we truly are. How many times have you heard the new right saying that, with globalization, we've all become robots, we're losing our essence, we're losing our humanity, and they've reached the point where now they directly quote the Marxist theory of alienation. So at the end of the day, because they have, as you said, this religious element against, let's say, materialism, against living on this earth, against you have also a body which you want to achieve things in this world, then they view achievement, or they view wanting to achieve stuff, they view this as a decadence. So here's an interesting horseshoe theory. The Frankfurt School and the New Right meeting in their opposition to capitalism and the industrial society and globalization. So the New Rights, they should say we're all Marcusians now.
Just a minor point to add on to that, to give the audience something to really think about this. Miko said the new right, and there's a discrepancy of when the new right starts, or the second new right, or the third new right. But it's just important that the era that they're talking about is the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. And these are the core decades when there's this explicit new right movement. Ayn Rand talks about it a lot in, a whole number of kind of essays and speeches at the time period of this burgeoning right movement that is becoming more collectivist and giving up the ideals that they, maybe only in word were at least, indicating or appealing to, like capitalism. And it's important to just, people can even go on YouTube and look up documentaries of the different events of the 60s and 70s and just ask yourself, if there's this big march through the institutions and this these ideas becoming accepted in some of the most, powerful intellectual kind of centers of our culture and of American society, well, what was this new right doing? When all these intellectuals were in colleges and in institutions, what was the new right at the time doing? And especially given there was this religious revival at the time. These are all events that I don't think get enough focus in the books. And just to point to Mounk on some of this and the Christianity point, I think it's important to note that one of the things he does in his book in a number of different places is kind of allude to the fact that the ideals, and Nikos talks about this a lot, but he's seeming to put forward the idea of, these ideas are good in theory, but not good in practice. And I think he calls them impeccable or impeachable ideals or things that these people are aiming at with the identity synthesis. And there's like a tiny kernel of truth that like there's a there, but the idea that their theory is good, just misplaced or improperly put into practice, I think we can get into it later, like the different ways it affects his actual narrative and like some of the actual shocking things he comes to actually suggest and put forward. And that, I guess that'll be part of our discussion.
This is one of the interesting differences between Mounk and Rufo, which is that whereas Mounk, as you say, says, well, the leftist ideologues who had these ideas had good intentions, but they didn't realize what the consequences of these ideas was going to be. Rufo is much more on the premise of these are nihilists, this is a kind of evil. So Rufo has this moral tone, which I think is probably more appropriate. The main problem with Rufo is that he only has it for the other side. He doesn't see the way in which his own side is partaking in many of these same ideas, and the way in which his own policy agenda, which if you know the way Rufo operates, Sam was alluding to his activism before these days, increasingly has taken on many of the same characteristics of the people he's criticizing. We should probably talk separately about that when we get to talking about how to oppose this idea. But I told you this before, Ibis, but like I think of Rufo as has a kind of street punk philosophy. Like he has become enraged by the evil that he has faced coming from the left, to the point of losing himself in it and basically mirroring it. I mean, so he reminds me a lot of the character Gail Wynand in The Fountainhead, who, literally grows up as a street gang member and who decides that it's a killer be killed world, and because that means there's no room for integrity or ideals in it, therefore he's got to compromise and he's got to be the one doing the killing, in effect. And I see Rufo as basically the same, and although not as admirable in certain ways as Wynand, because all of the kinds of Marcusean and especially Gramscian sorts of strategies that he describes, where the idea is take over the institutions, use the power of the state to quell dissent and opposition, basically describes to a T what Rufo is now advocating for conservatives to do now. And he doesn't talk about that in the book, but it betrays this huge blind spot that he has. And I find him kind of contemptible.
Just real quick on that. He doesn't mention it in the book, but Rufo and Mounk have actually had a debate before. I don't know if it's been one or two, but they've been in conversation. And in his more, speaking events, he's really clear. He wants to fight fire with fire. He wants to use their tactics against them. He literally, I don't have the quote in front of me, I'll find it, but he really means it, that he thinks the tactics worked. Let's do the tactics. That's his, he wants to get action now. His kind of pragmatic, like he said, kind of punkish view is let's get them now. The best way to to answer the cultural revolution, he literally says it's a counter revolution where we march through the institutions and we explicitly use political force. So where this met with Mounk and Rufo in the middle is, here's a concrete. Rufo absolutely, in terms of, there's these bad books in our public school system, in our education system. Well, let's ban those books and let's put mandates on the type of books we should have. And that pretty much runs through most of his analysis and suggestions.
And it came up just again recently with the controversy about the FCC that was making, threats against Jimmy Kimmel, where Rufo came out and said, turnabout is fair play. They've been trying to censor us with the FCC for decades. You quote unquote libertarian sorts who think that we should just abolish the FCC and have free speech. Well, first we've got to do it to them what they did to us. Like, it's so unprincipled and so despicable.
Yeah, and I think this relates to Rufo's, I think, very unphilosophical, unintellectual view of intellectual influence, of the way that ideas gain popularity or spread or people come to adopt them. Because, it comes back to this idea that, like, the way Rufo describes how leftist ideas took over, or the ideas of woke or the egalitarians took over, is like people like Marcuse and his followers took over institutions. They took power in universities, government, corporations, and then they like bombard. He uses this term. Actually, I'll read this quote because I think it's revealing of his view. He says, "The process works like this. The public consciousness is primed with new language, for example, male supremacy or institutionalized racism, and then subconsciously filters all subsequent experience through these conceptual frames, whether or not they correspond with reality." It's on page 44 of Rufo's book. And like the whole picture there is one in which, like, there's no, the human mind, the human person thinking and deciding and evaluating arguments and evidence is like not present in that picture. It's like someone primes people, the public consciousness, and then like everyone starts interpreting the world along the lines of this new ideology. And I think, like, if that's your view, then yeah, I think it makes sense why he then advocates basically doing the same thing for his side. That if his view is, yeah, this is how people were convinced of the kind of new egalitarian ideology, was people took over the institutions and pushed it out there. Well, if we want to fight it, we should take over the institutions and push a different set of ideas out there. And I think that's like completely wrong. It doesn't take the role of the mind and the role of like actual thinking and ideas at all seriously. And of course it leads him to do, so I agree with like the evaluation that this, I think he is ultimately like a pretty despicable figure and a negative, really negative influence in our politics.
And here's a meta danger here, Sam. If the only way to win this battle is through taking over the institutions, then democracy and the rule of law are a problem. Because in 3 years, maybe the Democrats are going to come back. So see how this puts in your mind authoritarianism as the only solution, right? That we need to grab power. And if there was a way that we keep it, maybe indefinitely, then that's good. Because if you don't fight the battle of ideas, then in 3 years, your enemy is going to come back. Now they're going to be even more determined. So they're going to overrun everything you've done. And then again, you're back to square one. That's why I will insist to what I said in the beginning. Any solution to this problem that does not focus on the battle of ideas is a solution that can only work through a very dark form of authoritarianism.
Just so that it's not like we're saying, because I don't think that, Rufo's the bad one and Mounk is the good one. I don't think that at all. I said before that part of the problem with Mounk's characterization is that he takes such a sort of detached academic perspective on these ideas. And yeah, he's more intellectual and he sees more of the intellectual influences, and he's more intellectually engaged in trying to refute some of the ideas that he disagrees with. And we should still talk about that and how he does that and Rufo doesn't. But at the same time, for him, yeah, it's about ideas, but it's not a battle of ideas, as Nikos is putting it. I think it has to be seen as both. There's ideas involved here. They're serious. They're intellectual. They appeal to people for reasons which are good or bad, but that doesn't make it an academic issue. It doesn't make it a detached, disinterested dispute. Like, these are life and death questions that these ideas raise, and life and death implications that they have for our lives. That's something that Rufo does see only on the other side. it's something that Mounk doesn't seem to see nearly enough, and that's a despicable thing too.
Can I quickly, I want to give the audience a little picture of Mounk here, just to kind of bolster your points. So one thing Mounk says is, he explicitly says the reasons for the rise of this movement may be understandable. And like I said, he thinks the motives are impeccable. And to go along with that, and how he sees the ideas working in the kind of landscape, he approvingly quotes, he says, quote, "As social psychologists have demonstrated again and again, we are capable of great courage and altruism when called upon to assist members of our group." And this is also, he says this also in relation to this idea that he has that our group identities, he holds, this kind of group identity-based thinking is kind of inborn or ingrained in man. He has this larger view of, and I don't think we should discount it. He has this larger view of human nature is such that it's almost, if you, and you guys can correct me, if the way he frames it, if you accept his view, he thinks that human beings inevitably, or in just inborn in human makeup, is this tendency for group thinking, and it's almost like it'll never go away. He doesn't take seriously the idea that it could be kind of overturned, or this isn't just something in us. He doesn't really accept that this is a kind of primordial infant human operating way of thinking that's very primitive, but precisely because it's primitive, it can be advanced from. And he doesn't do enough to talk about, well, what type of ideas would advance from. And this, I think, this becomes even more clear where he deals with the American tradition and the American experiment, and how he frames what he sees, and I think rightly, as the good tradition throughout that history. How the way he puts it and frames it, it's inclusive. It's an opening sphere of the government to be involved more, and it's better at managing these problems while going after these altruist ideals. But I mean, although it's grabbing onto a lot of kernels of truth, that's not exactly, I think that activates the wrong context for understanding the kind of the achievements of the American experiment. Take inclusivity of Black Americans into the rights protections of America after the Civil War. I think it's important that, yes, they were included in a view of rights, but more importantly than exclusion is that there was an expansion, an intellectual, moral, and then following from that, political expansion of the idea that the individual should be primary, that he does have rights of human nature, in fact, that because he has a mind and he can make choices, and that there's no reason to think that Black people are not capable of that. It's inclusive, but I don't, that kind of way of conceptualizing, I think it activates the wrong context when we're really talking about an expansion of, the role of the individual, not just some inclusion into the amorphous group of America. And yeah.
I think that's right, Ibis, and I think what this brings out is that while it's true that there's a way in which Mounk is more intellectual and interested in different ideological influences on this movement that he's criticizing, it's still the case that he's a very conventional intellectual, in that he's still basically on board with collectivism and egalitarianism, the same two ideas that are at the essence of the so-called woke movement. He really just wants a kind of watered down version of it that is synthesized with certain elements of individualism. And the way he usually expresses it, he's in favor of universalism. He wants a state that is neutral with regard to group identities, that takes the same position to all people. And yeah, that's right, but you're not going to really understand why it's right unless you bring in the issue of individualism, as you just did, Ibis, and he doesn't see that.
Yeah, I want to emphasize that, that issue of individualism, I think, is a really important point that is basically absent from both books. I mean, Rufo gives a little bit of lip service to the idea of individualism, but I think it's clear from the broader context of his own political project, and also just from the fact that there's not much of a material or an explanation of what that means and what he thinks of that as a positive, that he doesn't really have a serious commitment or conception of individualism. Mounk, I don't think uses the term, or if he does, it's very occasional. It's much more about universalism and liberal democracy, which he sort of treats as like a kind of mixture between the ideals of the American Revolution and a sort of like mixed economy liberalism of the 20th century. But individualism is really central to understanding what is wrong with the identity synthesis or woke ideology or whatever you want to call it. Because, I mean, going back to Mounk's own kind of identification of what this ideology is, I mean, a key point, the first point that he says is it's talking about this ideology tells people to look at the world through the prism of group identities. And then to start like thinking about the politics in terms of the treatment of identity groups that people are in. And so there's this whole orientation to viewing the world in terms of people being members of groups as opposed to being individuals with their own lives, values, rights. And that distinction is really fundamental when we're talking about society, collectivism versus individualism. And I think key to understanding this whole set of issues here, and I don't think either book is doing much to help us identify those issues as crucial to understanding what's going wrong and understanding what it would take for things to go right.
Sam, let me make concrete what you said in terms of how he can. So he promises that universalism is the answer to critical race theory, for example. And yet, notice how his philosophical starting point can only lead us to critical race theory. So in page 10, Mounk says something like, on average, black Americans continue to earn less and to own much less than white Americans. And then he gives some statistics, and then he says, the promise of full equality has proven elusive. Now, notice here, he's not talking about equality of rights. He's talking about equality of outcomes. So Mounk believes that there should be equal outcomes for different groups. The only way you could achieve this is through a racialism like the type of critical race theory advocates. What does critical race theory says? Forget about rule of law, forget about equality of law. The good is which brings up the less privileged group. So we should judge everything on whether it elevates, for example, black people. And what Mounk is telling us is, I'm against this thing, but already from page 10 of his book, he shows himself as buying into this egalitarianism, as you called it, and collectivism and egalitarianism. I see groups, and I want these groups to be equal in terms of results, not in terms of rights. How can you do this if not through the framework of something like critical race theory? So again, maybe great intentions, but if you start from the wrong starting point, what we call premises, then you're going to end up only in one direction, and that's the direction of tribalism and some form of political authoritarianism.
And at one point in his book, and I'm having trouble finding the page number, he talks about how, it's page 218. He talks about how one way to implement the egalitarian ideal of equal outcomes in all these different respects is precisely to drag everyone down to the same lowest common denominator level. And he takes for granted, well, nobody wants to actually do that. That would be terrible. And so we need to find another way to do it, in effect, is what he's saying. But that is, in fact, the way that people logically interpret this idea. As long as that is the ideal, that is the quickest way to achieve it. And you have to smuggle in a different set of ideas and values to explain why that outcome would be bad than the one that he's dealing with.
Minor add to that is that, in fact, I think we can see this because I'm having trouble. On affirmative action, Mounk has a take that seems to give a little bit more credence to, he doesn't think race-based affirmative action or quotas is a good thing, but he does support it. He does do the common socioeconomic replacement. He thinks that the socioeconomic status is, valid for kind of affirmative action or special treatment for the government, or at least special acknowledgement, which still, like, and this is something I've been mulling over in my head. I wanted to get you guys' thoughts. I thought it was interesting that Mounk is against identity groups, and he has this view, but he leaves a little room for socioeconomic status, which then makes me ask the question. I've always had this question: why isn't class considered an identity group, even though people seem to use it in the same way, at least politically? So it seems to be okay to say, for example, Mounk thinks that private social media companies are, in fact, doing something wrong, and in certain cases, so therefore the government should have a role in kind of controlling their speech, let's say, maybe not full-on censorship, or controlling their speech, and that the government should have some role in looking out for poor people or people in certain socioeconomic situations. And I just find it interesting that it's never these distinctions between like rich and poor, this social status or economic status is never thought of. When people become aware of the problem of identitarianism, they still hold on to this idea that, like, well, the identity that it's okay to be is the non-rich or the non-wealthy or the non-capitalist. And I just find that interesting.
I mean, I think that Mounk is essentially old left compared to the quote woke movement's new left, and you see that in this very issue. The way Ayn Rand analyzed the difference between the two of them was that the old left, the kind of classical Marxists, were, in fact, more universalist, in part because they were more intellectual. That their version of collectivism is still very much collectivism, but it's not such a tribalistic version of collectivism. It's based more on characteristics that join people together across countries and languages and races, and just so happens to be that class is one of them. You can have different amounts of income and still be oppressed by a capitalist, whether you're black or white. The novelty of the new left is the abandonment of these more universalist intellectualist standards and the elevation of just perceptual level tribal identities.
I wanted to get your thoughts on another aspect of Mounk's kind of characterization of these ideas and how they catch on, because one of the things that is important to his whole conceptualization is the idea that this ideology is a trap. I mean, that's the title of his book, The Identity Trap. And what he means by that is well-meaning people who are concerned about injustice, say racial injustice in America, and are frustrated with the fact that there still is racial injustice, there still is racism, and it seems like the sort of liberal approach that prevailed during the civil rights movement hasn't succeeded, or is taking way too long to succeed. That people who have that genuine concern could be trapped into adopting this ideology and to then starting to think about things in terms of racial group membership and oppressor-oppressed. And I think that I want to hear your thoughts on it, but I think there's something right about Mounk taking seriously that there are problems that this ideology claims to be addressing, and that's part of the hook by which it captures people. But I also think there's something about that it's just a trap that someone could easily stumble their way into. I think it strikes me as too generous, but maybe also coming from the place that Mounk is, of being much more similar to this ideology and having these kind of egalitarian and collectivist views himself, that is part of the context that makes him think that it would be easy to sort of get trapped by this ideology.
Yeah, I definitely want to say something about this, and sorry if there's some background noise. You might think, and I think you'd be right to think, that part of the issue with Mounk that you raise here is related to the problem we talked about before, about how he's too willing to say that the so-called woke have good intentions and just don't realize the consequences of their ideas. And that is part of what's going on here. But part of the reason that it's plausible to say that they have good intentions, even in the cases where they don't, is that they are using in their arguments and in their ideology the existence of some real injustices and some real evils, particularly of the racist variety, and saying, well, if you're opposed to that, then you should also be opposed to these other forms of inequality. And so it's not exactly a trap, as you put it, or as he puts it. It's what Ayn Rand called a package deal. It's you're selling an idea, you're selling it by misrepresenting, half or more of what you're selling, by packaging together something legitimate with it, and then people are buying it. And when they buy it, they do the buying because of some perceived value that they think they get from it, legitimate or illegitimate. And I mean, one of the things that I also wanted to talk about, because I don't want to just dump on Mounk here, is how insofar as he is buying into this package himself, I think he's at least recognizing, importantly, that there really were and can in many ways continue to be real racial injustices, for example, that afflict American society. And I mean, that's something somebody has to grapple with when thinking about how to respond to collectivist egalitarianism. And part of the response is going to be unpackaging the package. And that's something I should say, well, I don't think Mounk knows how to do. I think he tries to do it. He certainly doesn't know how to do it. Someone like Rufo doesn't even give a damn about trying. And you can tell because you can read his whole book, which, the multiple chapters which relate to critical race theory and related ideologies, from Angela Davis to Derek Bell to others. You could read the whole book and not even think that these people had any real problems to try to deal with. Like, you can read the story of how Derek Bell starts out as a civil rights lawyer in the South before he goes to Harvard Law School, and is continuously met with stonewalling and opposition from Southern jurisdictions who don't want to implement Brown v. Board. And most of the time he finally prevails, but not until, not after lots of losses and lots of opposition. And it's like, okay, so there were some real evil that he was fighting. Now, his mistake, I think, is to become so pessimistic about it in the face of the evil that he thinks no progress is possible. We just need to resegregate everybody. And so he kind of has the same problem as Rufo. And I think it's interesting that Rufo describes Bell's story without seeing himself in it, because I think Rufo basically does the same thing. He decides the left is so evil, there's no hope, we just need to do the same thing that they're doing. Bell did the same thing. A better, more rational and more optimistic way to respond to collectivist, egalitarian, tribalistic ideology will be not to pretend there are no racial problems, which I think is basically what Rufo is doing. Every once in a while, there's occasional glimmers of sympathy you see for the fact that people are undergoing terrorist threats in Jim Crow South. But they're so sparse and so rare, it's as if they weren't there. And if you really wanted to deal with the problem of the woke philosophy, you would be very concerned to do the unpackaging of this package deal, to identify what are the real injustices, and also to talk about what do you think are the real solutions to them. Rufo has nothing to say about that. Mounk at least has a little, but it's probably inadequate. And I wonder what you guys think about that. What are
one point on
ways
this,
to do
Ben? I also don't like just to dunk on a book, so let me say this, and maybe I should have started with this. My criterion for whether a book that criticizes a particular ideology, on whether that book is good, my criterion is always, would I give this book to some students who want to understand the ideas that are being criticized? And Mounk's books passes this test. Until now, I have found only 2 books that I've suggested to students, or I would suggest to students, not in terms of criticizing the ideas, but understanding the ideas. The one is Cynical Theories, the other is Mounk's book. So I think if you want to understand the woke ideas or the ideas of critical theory, if you read Mounk's book, you get a good grasp on this. And particularly one idea, he explains it very well. It's what he calls the identity synthesis, which is he's explaining intersectionality. So many people today are wondering, why are, for example, LGBT people for Gaza? Like, that makes no sense. Why would you support a society which would persecute you? I mean, and that's the least that would happen to you. And Mounk explains it, because he says that if you see everything through the prism of identity and the prism of vulnerability, which is another way of saying the theory of intersectionality, that you have many different identities and each of you give you, let's say, victimhood points. To be a good ally, to be a good woke person, for lack of a better term, you have to buy into the whole party line. So, for example, if you fight for the rights of black people, you also have to fight for the rights of trans people. And today we find ourselves in a very weird position. If you fight for the rights of black people, if you fight for the rights of women, you also have to fight for the right of post-colonial subjects. So here's the insanity. If you want to fight for the rights of women, you also have to fight for the rights of a regime that is literally institutionally misogynistic. And Mounk does a great job in explaining to you how we got to this insanity. So I want to give credit to the book for its good parts.
And one more thing I want to highlight that's really good in the book, I find. One, I think to go with Nikos, it is a valuable book to read, and I would recommend it. And it does have parts where it at least offers the fertile ground to think about. Like, one thing with the identity synthesis, he seems to think that a problem with it is that it affects yourself. And I think that's true. And that's a very important point. And then another thing I really, really liked in Mounk that I found nowhere in Rufo was just this is like I think this is a very big difference between, like, you could think of the soul of the left and the soul of the right, and like who's really worth engaging and speaking to. Because I'm on the fence of even talking to Rufo ever, but I would definitely have a conversation with Mounk. And here's precisely why. Mounk thinks that we need especially, and he says it to the left, embrace, valorize, champion, and improve the American experiment and the American tradition. He sees himself and the right side of history, so to speak, as coming from the founding fathers, being characterized by Frederick Douglass, the 19th century abolitionist, all the Americans who pushed for women's rights and gay rights, and I think that is absolutely right and healthy. We need to do a proper intellectual, philosophical approach to this whole issue, is not only, just fighting off the enemies, but understanding, like, the heroes of the past and the heroes we can be in the present. And, like, that's, I don't think, maybe under Ayn Rand, young Mounk does a good job in trying to, like, tell people that is part of this liberalism, this Enlightenment project, is integrating the American philosophy in all its core elements. And we would disagree with him about some of those elements and some of the people we'd put in the groups. Like, I don't think, for example, he makes a big enough distinction between Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King on the one hand. But these are all, like, the approach and the statement that the American tradition should be embraced, versus, like, Rufo's kind of empty statement. It's when more conservative people say they want the American tradition, I just hear they want the tradition of a liberalism, and what Mounk is about is the tradition of liberalism and the kind of self-reinforcing and self-correcting features.
Yeah, I would probably myself rather have a conversation with Mounk, though what I would want to have that conversation about is just how way too conventional his thinking is. It is admirable that he at least tries to analyze and criticize the ideas that he's opposing, even if he's doing it in a rather weak-kneed way. Like the way I see what Rufo is doing as a cultural commentator is, in effect, he quotes things that woke people say and then says, get a load of this. It's like, you who are in my audience, in my tribe of readers, you all recognize these as the enemies, and wow, don't you just love to hate them? Without bothering to explain, like, what's actually wrong with the things that he's saying, with the things that they're saying. And like, so he quotes various critical race theory people as saying that the founding fathers were evil because they had slaves. Well, we have some reverence for the founding fathers, but like, why is it wrong to say that they were evil for having slaves? I mean, slavery is pretty bad, right? So wouldn't you want to try to understand what's the proper way to think about the founding fathers, and to how do you unpackage their achievement from their actual evil? No, we're not going to touch that, because that would mean being somewhat critical of the the heritage that we all hold dear. Or, and this one's really crucial, when Derek Bell, who's one of the fathers of critical race theory, one of the reasons for his pessimism about the possibility of racial justice is that he sees racism as basically serving the entrenched self-interest of white people, and that even when it goes away in one form, it's going to crop up again in another, as happens, after the end of slavery and then the reintroduction of the Jim Crow laws in the South after Reconstruction. And again, Rufo quotes all the "get a load of this." Okay, well, what's exactly wrong with that? I mean, are you just conceding that that Bell is right, that it serves the self-interest of white people, or I mean, the closest that he comes is he quotes some of Bell's critics who say, no, actually, white people were selfless in their opposition to Jim Crow and when they engaged in civil rights activism. And so should we now take away with this the idea that we should all be selfless and oppose racism? And actually, racism is actually good for us. We should really all be we would be racist if we were concerned with our self-interest, but since we shouldn't be selfish, we should all be selfish. So there's just no attempt at analysis on these really crucial issues where, in many ways, the left and the egalitarians have done all the packaging, and Rufo's just swallowing the packaging and spitting it out rather than trying to chew on these ideas and tease them apart. What are the good parts? What are the valid parts? What are the invalid parts?
I think so one very quick point, Sam. Around 2021, our common friend Greg Salmieri said something which for me was a bombshell, because I've never heard it before by anyone. He said, actually, even if you're white, no rational person, no person who wants to live a proper human life, no one benefits in a racial society. If you truly understand what it means, I benefit from a society, even a white person who wants to live a good life does not benefit from a racist society. Of course, they're not the first victims. This is not equalizing the victim status. But I heard it, and to me, it was like, it was the first time I heard someone say it.
Just to bring both those points together, and really, like, I found this the most shocking statement in Rufo's book that I think captures both of what you guys are saying. I mean, he explicitly says that what we need to fight the counter-revolution, one of the things he lists is myth. He explicitly says to reignite the public sentiment, right? Because he doesn't think ideas will work. We need emotional appeals to reignite public sentiment, reach this I could go on about this conservative idea that, like, there's always some tricked group of true Americans, true believers out there who we just have to, they've been tricked or trapped, or, something's being hidden from them through myths, allegedly. So now to reach them, we have to stir up their hearts, not their minds, with myths about family, to get them back to family, Christianity, and community. I mean, explicitly, it's one thing to say he wants to siege the institutions, he wants to, match the institutions with new institutions. He wants to do everything the left wants to do with political force. He literally says he wants the intellectual coup needs to be followed by the bureaucratic coup, which is crazy. He says also on top of that he wants to put out myths, new myths for his people's hearts and feelings. And it's just so, I mean, the emotional, I can't express how much like the emotionalism, like coming out of that last chapter where he really gives his picture of the future. I mean, leading with the myths, I don't think you can't get better than that in terms of how much he thinks he has imbibed bad ideas and of this cultural revolution.
Yeah, I think it's noteworthy that Mounk has a whole section of his book, like many chapters, dedicated to trying to equip his reader with arguments against the woke ideology, identity synthesis, trying to give them advice on how to make the case for the kind of liberal ideas that he supports. Now, as we've all said, like, those arguments have serious issues. They're too conventional. They're often quite weak. They sometimes lead to upholding the same kind of the fundamental philosophical ideas behind the things that he's opposing. But at least he's exhorting his readers to make a case, to try to convince people, to try to persuade. Rufo, his section on what to do is just one chapter at the end. And it's focused on this call for a counter-revolution, which is, we've noted, is it seems to involve using a lot of the same tactics as the woke activists. And when it's put in terms of what he's actually calling on us to fight for, what are the values that we should defend, there's some mentions, very brief, of the Constitution and the American political system. But there's also that kind of just a list of homespun conservative platitudes. This is a direct quote: family, faith, work, community, country. These are I'm not against work or families or a country, but there's no content to these as he's presenting them. And I think that there is a kind of just appeal to what people's emotions, the kind of things that traditional conservatives sound good to them, but it's ultimately just kind of a set of platitudes, and there's nothing there that I think would convince someone who is sympathetic to more like the left-wing point of view, or is just not a conservative. It's just. I mean,
this is a symptom of his tribalism. This is why he is really no different in his operating principles than the people that he opposes. Why? What does the Constitution, achievement of Enlightenment Europe, which was radical in its rejection of the traditions of its day, cultural and political, what does it have to do with kids, family, and church, and mom and apple pie? It has very little. It's just that these are all the things I was told by my mom and dad that all went together, and they seem comfortable to me because I was always told that these are the things that go together. And anybody who wants to break up these packages or have one without the other, they're kind of alien and distant and scary to me. And I'm going to fight them because they want to take me away from comfort cultural food that I grew up with. That's the way tribalism operates. It's you revere the concrete a situation that you grew up in, the things you were told to value, and you don't bother ever thinking critically about them, thinking about what it is that makes them good, if they're good, or whether they're good when they're not.
And this Ben is selling America so short, right? Because let's think about it. Work, family, religion, country. How would this be different from someone who is a patriot in Azerbaijan or in Kenya or in Serbia or in South Korea? What is specific about this? Anyone anywhere in the world could claim these things, that I stand for these things. But with the United States, there's something else. There's something special. And notice how the new right or however you want to call it, but that political movement of which Rufo is a fellow traveler. Notice how time and again they try to persuade us, oh no, there's nothing special about the United States. We are just another country like everything else. And you claim that you people are defenders of you want to make America great again, when you are actually undermining it by saying there's nothing different between America and Albania or whatever, Luxembourg or whichever country in the world is based on some, I don't know, land and tribal tradition or history or whatever.
I want to circle back to something that came up much earlier in the conversation, because I think it's relevant to the kind of issues that we're seeing in Rufo and his approach to activism and the way that he views the world is, and that is the issue of the postmodern viewpoint and the relevance of that as part of the intellectual origins of woke ideology or whatever you want to call it. And it's interesting to me that it's not Rufo's focus. Rufo is much more focused on Marcuse and this kind of Marxist or variant on Marxism as the major origin point, and it's Mounk who talks much more about postmodernism. But my view, and Nikos, I'm particularly interested in hearing what you think about this, but my view is that a big important feature of the postmodern strand, so people like Foucault and Derrida, what they're bringing to the table is a deep skepticism about the possibility of knowing the truth about the world. And one of the things that's often said about postmodernism is it's a stance of skepticism towards grand narratives, towards having a sort of philosophical view, a philosophical understanding of a country, a political philosophy, like these kind of perspectives. And the things that we're endorsing here, that kind of an understanding of what America means as a country that has a distinct political philosophy that is distinctly good. Like, it's that kind of viewpoint and that kind of understanding that postmodernism is pushing back against and saying is like, that's impossible. You can't know something like that. And I think this is something that Rufo has actually adopted from the postmodernists somewhat, that he has this kind of this skepticism about truth, and he's much more, I mean, he'll say things about truth. He'll allude to we should stand up for truth, but he's not operating on the premise of arguing for things because they're true or trying to understand the value of America as a political system. He's much more pushing for power. And that's the kind of other side of the postmodernist thing, is like, there isn't truth. There's just these kind of systems of power that organize how we think about the world. And he's saying, we should push for our side to be in power rather than the other.
So let's try to put it very simply. What is Foucault about? So after Foucault, there is no more certainty. Foucault does away with certainty. So his work is he's diving into some notions that in our mind are clearly black and white. For example, someone is mentally, how to put it, challenged, or someone is sane, like craziness being sane. And Foucault digs the seed of doubt in that. He says, no, this was always an issue of power. And the difficulty with the work of Foucault is you're wondering, is he making a historical point? So, for example, does he say, in the 19th century, the way the psychiatric science was operating leaves many things under a question mark. Maybe some things were not good, which is a very legitimate point. Or is he saying that, you know what, you can never know who is... there is no distinction between being crazy and being sane, or in being a criminal or being a law-abiding citizen. So Foucault plants this seed of perpetual doubt. And there's not many miles away from a point of view that says you cannot say someone being sane from not sane. It's all a game of power. To fast forward today saying, yeah, who can say whether this is a man or a woman, or who can say whether torturing and kidnapping and raping is resistance or being barbarism and certainty. And very quickly, you also mentioned the postmodernist, post-structuralist. To make it simple to our audience, for the post-structuralists, everything is a language game. They say, look, you understand the world through language, through words, and the only way then that each one of us has its own vocabulary, which means reality is very subjective. I cannot agree with you because I have my own words, you have your own words, it's all subjective. And again, the end point is we can never be sure about anything. And the only way to fight this, the only way, and of course our audience should already realize we are in the sphere of epistemology, the field of philosophy which tells you how to understand the world. Therefore, it makes sense that the only way to fight this intellectual poison is with a better epistemology, a better way of understanding the world. But in order to say there is such a thing as a reality and I can understand it, and no, language is not just games, you need to have something like, let's put it in technical terms, a theory of concept, a theory of objectivity, like the world is out there, can I understand it in a way that makes sense? And again, we come back to the same problem. I think neither of our two authors, neither goes down that path and neither tries to provide the better way of understanding the world. And that's the central battlefield, one of the key battlefields here. Do we have a better epistemology, a better theory of reality, theory of knowledge to provide to these people? And again, I don't have to say the huge competitive advantage of objectivism, that it provides you the stable base from which you can attack this intellectual poison as I described. And it is poison because, again, if you follow its logical conclusion, well, who is to say, for example, then if terrorism is good or bad, or anything goes. And when anything goes, the gates of hell are open.
Yeah, I agree with all of that strongly, and especially the point you made, Nikos, that neither of these authors is adequately concerned with coming up with a better epistemology to understand the rot at the core of the postmodernist worldview. And that includes Mounk, who at least he tries to offer an alternative to it, but it's such a weak alternative. And I'll say a few words about why. So one sign of this is the way he addresses the so-called standpoint epistemology of the modern egalitarian collectivists. And this is an idea that comes right out of that doctrine from Foucault that you were talking about, that concepts don't have any objectivity to them. They don't give us real knowledge of the world, that they're instead just tools of engaging in power relations, whereby, you know, the people in power are the ones that define the terms and use them to their advantage. And that's, of course, a view that feeds into Bell's idea about why racism is supposed to be in people's self-interest. And you said, the way you put it, Nikos, was that with Foucault, certainty goes out the window. And it's certainly true that with Foucault, certainty loses even more credibility than it had before. But here's where it's important that it's not just Foucault that this begins with. And this is what both of these thinkers don't go, in effect, far back enough in the history of philosophy to see the roots of it. You see, for example, Mounk saying, well, in traditional epistemology, such as in Descartes, we're concerned with trying to understand what an objective definition of knowledge is in terms of justified true belief, etc., as though it wasn't Descartes who was the one to inject skepticism at the very foundation of Western epistemology in the Enlightenment. He was. I mean, he's famous for his evil demon argument, for why you can't know that you're not the victim of an evil demon, why you can't know that you're dreaming even as you think you're awake. And this is all with the assistance of arbitrary possibilities that you can't rule out because they might be true in spite of what our experience tells us. That's the same idea that ultimately Foucault is drawing on when he just takes what was originally skepticism about the senses and transmutes it into skepticism about concepts as such. It's something that he does with the assistance of Kant, who Rufo, for some reason, thought was beyond reproach. And Mounk's attempt to answer the standpoint epistemology view does not engage nearly enough with any of those foundational errors in Western epistemology. So standpoint epistemology, more popularly, is when people talk about their lived experience, like I have lived experience of oppression, and therefore you, white cis male, can't understand what I'm saying and shouldn't bother to try to critique it. I have my own truth. That's the standpoint epistemology idea. And Monk's response to it is to say, well, you have to distinguish between experiential and propositional knowledge. Experiential knowledge is something that only an individual can have, only they know what it's like to be them. But propositional knowledge is something that's universal. You can have a conversation with another person about the general concepts that we all share, regardless of our experience. Well, if you grant Foucault's skepticism about conceptual knowledge, you can't make this distinction between experiential and propositional knowledge, where the skepticism only applies to one and not the other. I mean, there is something right about the fact that people who have individual experiences experience what it's like to experience injustice in a way that those who don't. That's true. But unless you have a way of showing how universal concepts can be built up from experience in a way that applies across individuals, that isn't subject to the skepticism that Foucault is talking about, you have no way of answering that problem. And you have to very much grapple with the fact that, concepts in fact are human, quote unquote, constructs. The way that the egalitarians, collectivists, standpoint epistemologists talk about is social construction. That's the source of skepticism. Because there's construction involved, therefore there is manipulation and filtering and corruption in accord with the interests that go to form that concept. And what's true is that concepts are human products. They are the product of choices that we make. And they are also products of our values. There are values that knowledge serves. There are values that our concepts serve. You can't explain why that does not imply skepticism unless you have a theory of concepts that explains why you can distinguish between certain kinds of purposes that concepts can serve that are good, and certain kinds of purposes that concepts can serve that are bad, where the good ones are the interests of actual knowledge, that some ways of cutting up reality help us understand the world better, regardless of our idiosyncratic interests, and some of them don't. Some of them obscure the world from us, and that there are better and worse choices in the way that we define and slice up the world. And that's a conversation that goes well beyond what we can talk about today. It is a conversation that Ayn Rand starts in her book Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, but you can't grapple with that Foucauldian skepticism unless you take head on his and the more general postmodernist contention that the mere fact of human volitional construction of concepts creates skepticism and makes them non-objective from the get-go. And it's Mounk is interested at least critiquing that idea, but it's so superficial and so conventional, trying to take all Western epistemology on board as without above reproach, when in fact you have to attack a lot of the assumptions that go all the way back to Descartes if you really want to answer what the postmodernists say.
The comments from Nikos and Ben are great, and I can't really add to those. But as the junior fellow, I kind of wanted to. There's a question I have that I wanted you guys to help me understand, and hopefully the audience. So we started this kind of section on this idea that instead of Marxism, Mounk finds postmodernism to be more important, and one way he thinks of it is actually it's a synthesis, not an adaptation of Marxism. And I honestly, and he puts this in a whole appendix chapter of why we shouldn't call this Marxism. And I think this would be a debate that the audience is familiar with. And I didn't know what to make of his argument for why it's not. It makes sense why we shouldn't call it Marxism, but I'd imagine that would be unsatisfying to some, because at some points it's just look, this there's no other way we know to think of this except this is plain Marxist stuff. So far as most people have heard, this is typical basic Marxist similar things that so far as the public knows, which is I think why Rufo's kind of narrative account is appealing to some. But is it really does this point that not having a grand narrative or not having a utopian view is that really why it's not Marxist? Or or it seems like there is, from our point of view, there would be a reason to say there's a commonality with Marxists. And I just wanted to put that
Can I
on.
give a very quick answer? Because my biggest intellectual beef with most people these days is on this issue. So here are the three key elements of Marxism, and tell me if you find it either in the Frankfurt School or even more in the postmodernists. Marxism says history moves in a particular trajectory towards more and more progress and more developed social systems. Do we see this in the New Left? No, the New Left sees progress and they're like, whoa, this has gone too far. Second key tenet of Marxism, the working class is a revolutionary class which will organize in political power and form a revolution. Do we see this in the New Left? The New Left sees the working class as completely, absolutely brainwashed. They see the working class actually as a problem. And third key tenet of Marxism, we can understand history through the economics at the end of the day, to put it, they would say the force of production, but economics is the key field of the struggle. And what does the New Left says? Oh, no, forget economics, it's more about culture, or some people in the Frankfurt School, it's more about psychoanalysis. So the New Left rejects the three key pillars of Marxism. What do they keep from Marx? They keep some tools, some categories. For example, they talk about alienation, they talk about oppression, and they also, particularly the Frankfurt School, but not the post-structuralists, they see, in the last instance, capitalism is the problem. But imagine, people, if I came to you and I said, I don't believe that existence exists, I don't believe that reason is the way of viewing the world, and I don't believe in capitalism. So I'm gonna call myself a neo-objectivist. Like, this would make no sense. You should laugh at me and you should throw me out. So that's why I do not think that these movements actually signify the defeat of the political project of Marxism. This doesn't mean they're less dangerous, maybe they're more dangerous, maybe they are less dangerous. But let's make it clear, these are a major deviation from Marxism.
I basically agree with that. I would say that, like Nikos alluded to, the difference between the old left, the Marxist left, and the new left here, and this gets to what the difference is. We talked about it already with regard to why the difference in the kinds of collectives they identify with, that the Marxist collective is a more universal, more intellectually organized versus the perceptual level tribalistic collectives of contemporary collectivist egalitarians. So there's a dumbing down, there's an anti-intellectual element in the new left. That is definitely a difference. The thing I would go further and say is that another major difference between the two, that those who critique the so-called woke movement as neo-Marxist, I think, just don't get, is there's a difference in attitude, not just in the way you think about intellectual issues, but even the way you think about values. That, I mean, if you've read Dr. Peikoff's book, The Dim Hypothesis, I think the difference maps onto what he calls the difference between misintegration and disintegration, that he saw Marxism as closer to religion insofar as it seeks a systematic understanding of the world for the sake of trying to live in it. It's just that it's massively misintegrated. Whereas the more modern intellectual movements, such as modern egalitarianism, are what he calls disintegrated. They take a disintegration as their touchstone, and they are less interested. And this is the way in which postmodernism represents the rejection of grand narratives. That it doesn't try to understand the world in terms of any kinds of principles, in part because it's less ostensibly interested in trying to live in the world, and it's much more nihilistic in its orientation, much more interested in just destroying other people's integrations, whether Marxist or liberal. And so I think there is a real difference in orientation there. In a way, calling the contemporary egalitarian collectivists Marxist of any stripe is, and people will take this the wrong way, it's paying too much of a compliment. Like, Marxism was a more intellectual movement that at least had the simulacrum of some values that it was trying to fight for, whereas the contemporary egalitarians are just really aimed at destruction. And so it's true that they're both opposed to capitalism, The contemporary egalitarians really just want to tear it down. They don't want to replace it with anything. And this is, Foucault is an example of this. He was against Marxism, he was against Soviet communism, and he was against capitalism too. He was really just against everything and didn't see anything, didn't want to try to offer a contemporary alternative. Now, one thing I will say to qualify all of that, where I think it is still useful to make a certain kind of comparison to Marxism, is that, the contemporary egalitarians do import certain categories from Marx. They do import, for example, the idea of a collective that they think people identify with. They use that collective to somewhat different purposes. They use it with a kind of strategic essentialism, as Mounk talks about, where they don't really think there's anything uniting them together as a group, essentially, because they reject all essences. But they pretend like there is so that they can beat down the other tribe. That's the tribalistic, nihilistic element. And the other thing I think where there is a similarity that's worth understanding is that even though there's a point to the idea that religion and Marxism are more intellectual and kind of ostensibly aim at certain kinds of values they're trying to achieve as opposed to being overtly nihilistic, I do think that both religion and Marxism are covertly nihilistic. And this is true, as we talked about at the beginning, of all irrational ideologies, that part of why they appeal to people is that they offer people something to serve certain kinds of neurotic, vicious aspects of their psychology. And even though Christians and Marxists talk about some better world or better ideal that they want to seek, I think at the end of the day, these are rationalizations, that they're not really interested in achieving positives. They're really interested in bashing whoever they hate with these ideas. And so I think the way to understand the New Left and contemporary tribalistic egalitarianism is it's just the nihilism that was implicit in both Christianity and Marxism from the beginning, coming into its own, coming out into its naked essence without nearly as many trappings of rationalizations about the positive values they want to achieve. And that's something that I don't think either Mounk or Rufo really want to grapple with. Mounk certainly doesn't, because he thinks that it's only good intentions that are moving the woke movement. Rufo sees that there's nihilism. He doesn't understand where the nihilism comes from. He doesn't see why it is that anybody would want to destroy another people, and why you can find why you wouldn't want to destroy, why people, he doesn't understand why there's a desire for destruction of value. And he doesn't see that that same motive is implicit in the very Christianity that he reveres so much, and that that's where the New Left is getting it from.
I think it's almost time to wrap up this discussion, but I wanted to just check if anyone has any final thoughts or points we didn't get to, or kind of summing up statements on your views of these books.
I think we said it all. I just say, reiterate, I think Mounk's book is worth reading. Rufo's less so, but it does has interesting journalistic details. Thankfully, which is, like Sam pointed out, oddly, he puts all his kind of takeaway points in the last chapter. So for those interested, I think it'd be worthwhile to gather some of those details that he mentions. But a lot of them can be found in Mounk. And Mounk offers way better material for thinking. And I'll just emphasize that from my perspective, one of the best things you can take away with is all the advice we gave here, and a focus on this American Enlightenment achievement that we should all see ourselves a part of.
Yeah, just two very quick points. One, you cannot fight ideas by adopting their starting point, by agreeing on their starting point. You're going to end up on the same end point. And something like for behind the scene for our audience, the way this podcast worked, Sam put tremendous work. He had 20 points of 20 pages of notes, literally. And then during the episode, he shared the ball. So if this was a nice discussion, keep in mind that Sam could have delivered a solo episode of 3 hours with the work he put on that podcast. So thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Nikos. My final thoughts. I agree that Mounk's book is, I think, significantly stronger than Rufo's, and it's the one that's worth reading. I would say especially the first half, because I think Mounk he's stronger when he's describing the intellectual history and presenting the kind of key ideas and developments in the rise of this ideology. And then he attempts to give his own like response and advice on how to make the counter argument. And while I could applaud the effort, I think it's not a particularly strong rebuttal and a particularly strong arguments. So if you just read the first half, I think you'll get a lot of the value from the Mounk book. With Rufo, I think it's much more interesting from the perspective of understanding how Rufo thinks about these things and how Rufo is telling people on the right to think about these things and how to operate in opposing the left. And I think, like as we've said throughout the podcast, like there are serious problems with that, to say the least. Like there's something really bad about what the conservative opposition to this is doing. There's something really tribal and really having authoritarian and collectivist elements to the conservative opposition. And there's things in the way that Rufo presents these things that can, I think, provide some indications as to where that's coming from. And there's some journalistic stuff about the kind of history of leftist political movements. But if you're trying to understand the ideas and how these theories came to prominence and how people came to be convinced of them, I think you'll learn much more on that from Mounk. Although, as we've said, there are things that Mounk is not getting right as well.
I think Mounk is worth reading if you are interested in seeing what it looks like for someone to try to oppose deadly errors within his own side of the political spectrum, within his own political camp. That's what Mounk is doing. I don't think he's succeeding because he's not willing to fully break with the prejudices and premises of his tribe. Rufo is interesting to read if you want to see what it looks like for someone to grapple with what is, in fact, I think, a real evil, but to do so in a way that becomes obsessed with that evil enemy to the point of, in effect, becoming him. And that is something to read if you want to avoid it.
We can't top that ending, so
yep.
Thanks
Thank
for
you all
watching.
for this discussion.